Okay, so welcome back. Listen to myself after Hanukkah. Hope you all have a good Chag. This week, so we're continuing in Menahot, and this week we're going to be learning a sugya in Menahot daf Samach Daled Amud Bet, which basically we'll see the context inside, but it's going to be discussing somebody who appears as part of the story of the people who came back at the beginning of the building of Bayit Sheni, or at the Shivat Zion. And there's a list of people that are mentioned, and there's a list that's kind of given both in Sefer Ezra and in Sefer Nehemiah, with a subtle difference, which is kind of a springboard for the Midrash to start to build all sorts of theories around who the people that are mentioned are, and then kind of use that to learn some interesting things about Mordechai from the Megillah. So we'll see kind of the textual issues that the Midrash is trying to address, and then maybe try to understand thematically what it's trying to get at as well. So if we just look at the first two sources here from Ezra Perek Bet and Nehemiah Perek Zayin, so see if you can note the difference between these two psukim. So from Ezra Perek Bet, so it says, Ele b'nei Medina ha'olim mishvi ha'gola, asher egla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel levavel, v'yeshuv Yerushalayim v'Yehuda ish li'iro. Right. So the beginning of Ezra talks about the group of people that went back after Koresh made an announcement that the Jews are allowed to go back to Yerushalayim. So there was a group of people who went, and there was a leadership, certain people who were in charge. Asher ba'u im Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel was a descendant of David and of the kings, and he was, even though he wasn't a king himself, he was kind of in charge and had that authority. But with Zerubbabel were Yeshua, Nehemiah, Seraya, Re'elaya, Mordechai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rechum, Ba'ana, Mispar, Anshe, Am Yisrael. So it's a group of people that went with Zerubbabel. They're listed by name. They're obviously men of importance. And he gives a list here, and included in the list is somebody named Mordechai, which is followed by Bilshan, which will be relevant later. In Nehemiah Perek Zayin, it gives a similar, almost an identical pasuk, right? Ele b'nei Medina olim mishvi ha'gola, shegla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel, v'yeshuv Yerushalayim v'Yehuda ish li'iro, habim im Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Azariah, Ra'amya, Nachamani, Mordechai, Bilshan, Misperet, Bigvai, Nechum, Ba'ana, Mispar Anashim, Anshe Am Yisrael. So if you look just carefully at these two psukim there, you can match up the words basically one to one, with the exception of the list of people. There is a slight difference between the list of people, and that will become relevant in a moment. But first, let's ask the question. Included in this list, there's a whole bunch of names that aren't particularly interesting to us, but the name Mordechai should pop out as something that is familiar to us. Who is this Mordechai? So the Ibn Ezra comments, and he says, Hu Mordechai Yehudi? That is Mordechai HaYehudi, right? The implication being that it's Mordechai from the Megillat Esther. Rak Bilshan yitachen shu ish acher v'hu chaser vav ke'adam shet enosh. So the first pasuk in Divrei Yamim, right, is Adam shet enosh. It gives us a lineage of the people from the first man and then his descendants, and it doesn't add a vav in between. It just gives a list of each person and their son. So Ibn Ezra's kind of grammatical insight here is when it says Mordechai Bilshan, it's two different people, similar to Yeshua, Nehemiah, Seraya, Re'elaya, Mordechai, Bilshan. We said each of these is independent, so Bilshan is one person. And there's Mordechai included in this list. That Mordechai happens to be Mordechai from the Megillah story. The Malbim in his commentary says, Ledat Chazal hu shem echad. Mordechai Bilshan is one name, and Bilshan is a descriptor of Mordechai. What does it mean? Mordechai she'yada kama lashonot. Okay, so Bilshan comes from the word lashon. So Mordechai Bilshan, rather than being, sorry?
A polyglot.
A polyglot, indeed. Yes. That's a good word, yeah. So he knew, we'll see actually 70 languages. He knew many languages. And then Malbim says, L'dad yesh shem efarshim hem shnei shemot. Right? And the Malbim acknowledges that there are others, such as Ibn Ezra, who says that Mordechai and Bilshan are just two different people. That's probably also more of the pshat. But he notes that Chazal combined Mordechai and Bilshan together. So why are they doing that? So if we look in the Gemara and Megillah and Daf Tet Zayin Amud Bet, it has a very surprising teaching. It's before even reading it, right? Mordechai comes out of the Megillah story being a pretty respectable, good. So he's the hero of the story, right? And there isn't much bad that you could say about him. And yet, in the Gemara and Megillah, Daf Tet Zayin Amud Bet, it says as follows: Ki Mordechai Yehudim Mishneh LeMelech Achashverosh, the last pasuk in the Megillah, V'gadol Yehudim V'ratzui L'rov Echav. So it says he was Ratzui L'Rov Echav, right? He was beloved by or accepted by most of his brethren. So the Gemara knows L'Rov Echav v'lo L'chol Echav. So that means there were some people who didn't like him. Who were they? So there's a few things here, right? One is that Mordechai was on the Sanhedrin, and two is that some, a minority, ostensibly, some of the Sanhedrin, pirshu mimenu, they distanced themselves from him. Why did they do that? Amar Rav Yosef, Gadol Talmud Torah yoter mi'atzalat nefashot. So Rav Yosef says it's more important to learn Torah than to save lives. How do we know this? That first Mordechai is listed after 4, and then he's listed after 5. How do we know this? Mikara dechtiv, the pasuk in Ezra, Asher ba'u im Zerubbabel, and this is what we saw earlier. Yeshua, Nehemiah, Seraiah, Elaiah, Mordechai, Bilshan. So Mordechai comes after 4 other names. But in Nehemiah, it says Habim Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Azariah, Ra'amya, Nachamani, Mordechai, Bilshan. So it doesn't acknowledge here that the names are switched a little bit. It's not identical, but it does say that there is another name that's inserted. In other words, Mordechai comes after 5 instead of after 4. So what does it mean after? So Rashi in his commentary says as follows on this Gemara. He says, Shepirshu mimenu. So what does it mean the Sanhedrin separated themselves from Mordechai? Right, we know that Mordechai became basically a government official. He was given by Achashverosh the ring and he became somebody who was involved in government affairs, right? And he was batel midivrei Torah as a result. And that was something that apparently some members of the Sanhedrin did not approve of. Mi'ikara, what does that mean? Bimei koresh kshe'alayim Zerubbabel min hagolah Mordechai imo v'nimnu b'sefer Ezra. So the list, chronologically, in Ezra is in the context of Koresh's announcement. And so that was the list that went up there. But then Chafdalet Shana haya ben minyan leminyan bimei Koresh l'Daryavesh ha'acharon. There was 24 years that elapsed between when Koresh's announcement, which is the chronological context of Ezra, according to Rashi, and what Nehemiah is discussing when Nehemiah lived, which is when Daryavesh was king, which was 24 years afterwards. And so it's no accident that the list in Nehemiah is slightly different than the list in Ezra. It's saying that the list in Nehemiah was after Mordechai had already gone from being a Talmid Chacham on the Sanhedrin to a government official, and that's why he's bumped a little bit later in the list, from being after 4 to being after 5. And so Rav Yosef learns from that Talmud Torah is more important than saving lives, because apparently the Chachamim did not approve of the fact that Mordechai was dealing with saving lives through his role as a government official in the palace of Achashverosh versus learning Torah, right? So that in of itself is kind of a sharp teaching. There's also a few kind of open questions here, which for me are kind of interesting. Number one, why is Mordechai 4th or 5th on the list if he's more, he should be first. But leaving that aside, there's this really subtle diuk in this list between these two sources that are otherwise identical that Rav Yosef is extrapolating from it an incredible chidush about how important Talmud Torah is. One assumption that's being made here, of course, is that the Mordechai in these lists, and this is what Ibn Ezra said, is identical with the Mordechai of the Megillah. And the question is, does that make sense? And the answer depends on when the Megillah happened, right? And this is something that's not entirely clear because there's all this midrashim and scholarly work about the Achashverosh and the Megillah and that whole story.
Also, the math is tricky, I think.
Yeah.
There's some writing about that, the timeline. I think is a little iffy.
Yeah.
Based on certain sources.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's some years that aren't accounted for, right? Exactly. So I do know that the prevalent approach in the Midrash is that the story of Esther happened during the 70 years between Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni. So if we leave aside whatever kind of scholarly discrepancies there are, that would then potentially make sense with this in the sense that if that happened during the 70 years and then this group is called up at the end of the 70 years when Koresh makes the announcement, so then Mordechai from the story could be the same Mordechai from here.
There's also the pasuk in Megillah that talks about Asher Aglam Yerushalayim Megillah.
Yeah, so he must have lived during that time, exactly. That's true. I didn't even think about it. It says here, Asher Hagla Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel.
Exactly, that's what it says in the Megillah.
Good. Okay, so maybe that's good textual support for saying that it's the same person. It says Asher Hagla, the same exact. Didn't notice that. Correct. I think another connection is in Sefer Ezra, Perek Dalet. It actually mentions Achashverosh in Sefer Ezra. So it's all kind of at the same time. So it does make sense to connect this Mordechai, perhaps, with the Mordechai from the Megillah story, chronologically, not just in the sense that the Midrash wants to maybe make some diuk about Mordechai's status, but also in that sense. Because the Midrash doesn't always feel confined by that, is the point I'm making.
Right.
Like, it'll often identify people who lived hundreds of years apart as being the same person. But here it actually does maybe make sense historical, right? It could fit even historically. Good. But we still need to understand what this idea of Bilshan is, that we saw in the Malbim, right? The Malbim said, "L'dat Chazalu Mordechai she'yada kama leshonot." So what is the idea behind that? So to understand that, we need to take kind of a step back and learn a different sugya. The Mishnah in Menahot teaches as follows. So Menachot is talking, and this comes later in our Masechet, but it teaches as follows. It says, "Mitzvah omer la'avi min hakarov." So the omer has to be produce from the field, that you're supposed to bring it from close to Yerushalayim. Lo biker hakarov Yerushalayim. If at the time of Tetzayin Nisan, the omer around Yerushalayim has not yet ripened or become mature. So mevin oto mikol makom. In other words, it's a mitzvah min muvchar to bring it from close to Yerushalayim, but that's not ma'akev. If it's not ready yet, then you can bring it from further away. Maaseh sheba omer migagot tzrifin v'shtei alechem mibik'at en socher. And the Mishnah concludes and says, 1 year they brought the omer from gagot tzrifin and the shtei lechem for Shavuot from bikat en socher. We'll see in a second what that means, but the obvious implication here is that those are far away from Yerushalayim. That 1 year they had to bring it from there. So Rav Ovadia Bar Tanur in his commentary on the Mishnah, he says as follows, just to understand it a bit better. So mitzvah omer lavo mi'akarov mimakom shekarov l'Yerushalayim. Why? Lefi she'ein ma'avirin ala mitzvot hilkach sheyotze mi'Yerushalayim levakesh omer ota tfuah shemotzer Rishna not la. He says, right, Zurizin makdim in the mitzvah. Basically, you should take the first thing you can get, just because it shows that you really want to fulfill the mitzvah. Lo biker, lo bishel kol socho, but if it's not fully ripened, and then maaseh sheba migagot tzrifin va'en socher rechokim Yerushalayim harbe. They're very far away from Yerushalayim. And then he says, "Umipnei shecharivu hagiyasot kol tfuot shesivot Yerushalayim." That in that year, it wasn't just that it hadn't ripened, but that I guess the Roman legions or armies had destroyed all of the produce in the area of Yerushalayim. There was some destructive kind of force that came through, so they had to go really far away that year to bring the omer, but it was still, kasher. Good. The Gemara then on that Mishnah teaches as follows: Maaseh sheba omer migarot tzrifin u'shtei alechem mibagat en socher. Okay, kimata omer, and it explains what happened that year. When the omer was brought, lo havu yadei mehecha aiteh omer. They didn't know where it came from. So achrizu, they announced, this is the omer. So ata hu charsha, so a deaf person came, otiv, chade yada a'igra v'chade yade atzirfa. So he pointed one hand in the direction of a roof, and he pointed one hand in the direction of tzrifa, which I actually forget what that means. I actually have it here. Sorry.
It's like like a hut, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think so. I think you're right. Thank you. So like one direction in a roof and one direction in a hut, maybe something else. I need to look it up. So Amar Luhu, Mordechai. So Mordechai said, Mi ika duchta dishme gagot tzrifin o tzrifin gagot. So Mordechai says, does anyone know of a place called gagot tzrifin or tzrifin gagot? In other words, he saw that this deaf person was pointing to a gag and a tzrifa, and he just said, since this person's deaf, he must be saying gag tzrif or tzrif gag. Badku v'ashkechue, and that's how they learned that the omer had come from gagot tzrifin. Ki ba'ila tu ishtei alechem, and the same thing happened with the shtei alechem. Lo yade mehecha. They didn't know where it had come from. Achrizu, and they announced, they said, does anyone know? Ata hu gavra charsha, and the deaf person came. Oftiv yadei ha'einei v'chad yadei ha'sichra. So he took one hand, he pointed to his eye, and another hand, he pointed to sichra, which...
Is it a dam?
Dam?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, it's modern.
Yeah, I got a Jastra. It is perhaps.
I'll go real quick.
You can just look it up if you want. It's Menahot, Samach Dalam, I bet. Yeah. It's not so relevant. Just that he pointed to whatever was something. Yeah. He pointed to his eye and to something. But you're probably right. Thank you. So Amarlu Mordechai, again, someone named Mordechai pops up and says, Umi kaduchta d'shme ein socher or socher ein. Right? Does anyone know of a place that's either, he didn't know the order, right? But go vashkachu, and they found that it was ein socher. So this Mordechai put together from the fact this deaf person's pointing to these two things, that the name of the place where it came from is a combination of those words. The Gemara continues and says, Hanau shalosh nashim. This is actually an interesting story. Hanau shalosh nashim de'aitu shalosh kinin. Okay, so 3 women that came, and they brought with them 3 kinin, right? Kinin are bird offerings. So they bring birds to be offered. Chada amra lezivati. One said it's for my zava, because if a woman is a zava, right after she has to keep the tumah when she comes to be mitaheret, so at least in those days, she had to bring kinin as part of the offering. Chada amra liamati, and one said liamati, v'chada amra leonati. So it's not 100% clear what each of them meant. Savur mina, but the rabbis at the time understood from this zivati zava mamash, that the woman who said it's for my zivati, she meant that she had been a zava. Liamati mamash, lonati lonata. That basically each of them is talking about like different ways of talking about their time, right? The ona is the time of the month, and that basically they're all coming to bring like a korbanot to be metaher for the fact that they had been in nida or been in zavod.
Sorry, I was wrong. It was a door latch. I don't know why I thought
a door latch. Oh, okay. What is a tzrifa? It is a hut. Okay, so you were right about that. Okay.
It's like modern Hebrew. Tzrifa is like a tent.
Yeah. Sichar is a door hatch. Door latch?
Door latch, yeah.
Door latch. Okay. Good.
Sure, why
not? Okay, thank you. So they assumed the 3 women came and said that it's like the zivati liamati lonati. So they figured, okay, the korban that you're supposed to bring to be metaher from those things, you have to bring 2 birds. One is a chatat and one is a olah. That's what the Torah says. They each brought 2 birds, so that was the assumption they made. D'chulu chada chatat v'chada olah. Amarlu Mordechai. So Mordechai again comes along and says, Shema bezov sichna, Shema biyam sikna, Shema biyam sikna, Shema be'ena sikna. D'chulhu olod ninhu. So he says, maybe they're each saying, I'm bringing 2 birds because I had been in danger in relation to something. So the first one who said lezivati, that she had been in danger when she was a zava. And she's bringing 2 birds as a Thanksgiving offering, right? As 2 olot, and saying that it was at the time that I was a zava. And similarly, liamati, maybe when she was at sea, she was in danger. And so for all of them, he says that they were just giving kind of reference to, not that they were halachically they were in a certain period and they're bringing korbanot as part of that halacha, but rather that they're just bringing korbanot todah and they're giving some kind of reference to what they're thankful for. Right? And then, baduk veshkach. And so they checked what Mordechai said, and he was right. Okay? So we have here the story of some guy, Mordechai, who was able to understand from this deaf person kind of what's going on, and also this insight into birds. So what's the connection between them? The haynu ditnan, and this is as it was taught, petachia ala kinin. So a person named Petachia, at the times of the Beit HaMikdash, had been in charge of the bird offerings. Zeh Mordechai. Petachia was Mordechai. Lam nikra shmo Petachia. Why was that his name? Poteach dvarim v'dorshan v'yodea b'shivin lashon. His real name was Mordechai, and he was given the name Petachia because he used to open words and be medare, like doresh. And he also knew all 70 languages. And the Gemara asks, but Kulu Sanhedrin Nami Yadei Shivin Lashon. Right? But the whole Sanhedrin knew 70. Like, why is that noteworthy? Every member of the Sanhedrin apparently knew all 70 languages. Tamar B'Yochanan, Ein Moshivin B'Sanhedrin, Ela Ba'alei Chochma, Ba'alei Mar'eh, Ba'alei Koma, Ba'alei Zikna, Ba'alei Kshafim, V'Yodim Shivim Lashon. Every member of the Sanhedrin was wise, good-looking, tall, old, knew sorcery, and knew 70 languages. So rather, Shilote Sanhedrin Shomat Mipia Turgaman. Right? And the reason for that was not just stam, but it was so that they could, when they heard testimony, they could hear it in the original language, which is important, that nothing would get lost in translation. They could be able to adjudicate, fairly. So then why is it special that Petachia / Mordechai knew 70 languages? Ella, Dehava, Bail, Leishne, Vedarish. But it wasn't just that he knew 70 languages, but he knew how to interweave them, the wordplay between them, to kind of be midaresh different languages together in a way that the other members of the Sanhedrin who knew all 70 languages didn't necessarily know how to do. Haynu dechtiv Mordechai Bilshan. And that is why by Mordechai in Sefer Nehemiah and in Ezra, it gives him the epithet of Bilshan, because he was someone who knew how to be Bail Leishne Vedarish. So this comes to explain, right? So what evidence do we have for this, right? So we saw this story earlier. We saw that he understood the language of Gagot Srifin and the Ein Socher. He picked up on the language. Even sign language, exactly. But he was someone who knew how to be medaresh words, even between languages. And that's why he was given the name Mordechai Bilshan. What's the problem here? And I kind of gave a hint to it before. The
timing?
Yeah, good.
How long was it once they got back until it was built?
The Beit HaMikdash?
Yeah.
A while.
Yeah.
It was not fast.
Right.
He was already an older guy.
Yeah.
If he even... Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact timing of it, but it took a long time to build the walls, and then it was a long process until they actually built a Beit HaMikdash. It took a while. So.
That's true. That's a good point. I think the question is even much stronger, though, because who does it identify Mordechai with in this Gemara? It says Mordechai is someone named Petachia, right? So it's the assumption that this Petachia served in the Beit HaMikdash
before, after.
At the time of Shivat Zion or much later, right? And in fact, if we skip down now to the Mishnah Shkalim, it says, Elu hen hamimunin shayu b'mikdash. Yochanan ben Pinchas al chotamot, Achia al nesachim, Matitya ben Shmuel al paisot, Petachia al kinin. Petachia is a Mordechai. That's a Mishnah Shkalim. And the Talmud Yerushalmi on that Mishnah says, Petachia al kinim, Bo re'eh ma gadol hu kocho shel oto ish. Come see how great was the power of this man, Petachia, shu potech bidvarim v'dorshan v'yodea shivim lashon, which aligns with what we saw here, but it's hard to believe that this list is mentioning people from 400-something or 500-something BCE, but rather a list, at the time close to the writing of the Mishnah. And so it kind of begs the question of then, are you saying that Mordechai lived from the time of Shivat Zion to whenever this list of Mimunim were alive? If that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the people, and it references that they were Hagla Yerushalayim in the days of are their families.
Okay.
They come from the families that, and not that they were in Yerushalayim then themselves.
Got it.
That would push Mordechai later, but it still wouldn't help the problem of 400 years.
I think your Tosfot says your answer, but kind of with a twist. Okay. I mean, almost the opposite of it, actually.
Oh, okay. Quite a twist.
Right. So he says, Perush bekuntrus, dehu Mordechai sheyabi me'achashverosh. So Rashi in his commentary in this Gemara Menahot has no problem saying the Mordechai in discussion here is the one from the Megillah. V'tema, Tosfot says, but that is, difficult. Hu lomar she'erich yamim kol kach, to say that he lived for all those years. V'nireh al shem Mordechai harishon hayu nikra'in hamimunin al shemo. So basically Mordechai was almost like a title that was given to people who came later that were of Mordechai character. Okay, so what does he say? The reason why the Talmud Yerushalmi here goes out of its way to talk about Kama Gadol Kocho Shel Oto Ish is Potech B'Dvarim V'Dorshan is to show why Petachia was identified with Mordechai, not necessarily the literal historical figure, but almost the idea of Mordechai and who he was and what he represented, that was an honorary title given to Petachia later on. But he lived hundreds of years later, as Tosfot is kind of more willing to admit. And Ein Yaakov actually gives a nice support to this idea. That's the commentary on the Gemara in Menahot and the Ein Yaakov. So the Iyun Yaakov, excuse me, it's a typo here. The Iyun Yaakov in his commentary says as follows: Shepotech dvarim v'dorshan, ulefi ma shekatvu Tosfot nikaraim al shem Mordechai harishon, v'gabei ktiv v'doresh tov le'amo. So the Iyun Yaakov notes at the end of the Megillah, it talks about Ki Mordechai Yehudi mishanem chashverosh v'gadol Yehudi matur l'rechav doresh tov le'amo. So pshat there is doresh tov le'amo. It means that Mordechai sought out good for his people. In other words, he was in charge of the Jews, so he was doresh tov le'amo. But the drasha here is it means doresh tov, that he was a good darshan, right? For his people. Ulahachi nikarim al shemo. In other words, Mordechai's legacy was that he was a doresh tov, and the way that this petachia is described is that he was somebody who was potech b'dvarim v'dorshan. He was a darshan of languages, like we saw with the gagot tzrifin and Ein Socher. And so Mordechai, according to the Iyun Yaakov, was also doresh tov, and that's why petachia was given the title of Mordechai, because it's consistent with his legacy. I want to finish with, I think, a nice kind of layer on top of this. We've said, basically, the idea is that Mordechai, why was he Bilshan? What sets him apart? Right? Everyone on the Sanhedrin knew 70 languages, but Mordechai Bilshan, he didn't just know 70 languages, he knew how to weave them in with each other and be doresh them, the connections between the languages. And so there's kind of this beautiful tie to Mordechai's name himself, where what does the name Mordechai mean? So, and leaving the scholarly approach aside as Marduk and all that, but right. But the Gemara in Chulin on Daf Kuf Lametet has the following Gemara. It says, Amrile Papunai Lerav Matna. So there's the Papunai asked Rav Mata. Okay, first I start with the halacha question. Matzah ken b'rosho shel adam mahu. So if you find a nest on a person's head, is it chayav and shiluach haken or not? So Amar, so he answered, there's a pasuk in Shmuel where it says, Vadamal rosho. Someone comes, I think the context there is in mourning, and they have like dirt on their head. So he says, so you see from here that dirt can be on someone's head. It's still called Adama. So that teaches me that shiluach haken does apply, even if there's a nest on somebody's head, because Rosh is like Adama. Okay. At least I think that's what that means. Leaving aside the halachic shiluach haken piece, but then they continue and ask totally unrelated questions. Moshe min haTorah minayin. So this is a famous Gemara. I don't know if we've learned it before, but huh? Yeah. So where is the reference to Moshe in the Torah? Like what does that question mean, right? Moshe min haTorah minayin. So Rav Matna answers, and he says, right before the flood, God, Hashem regrets having made man, and he says something along the lines of B'shagam hu basar, like because he is flesh, he has sinned. Ve'ayu yamav 120 shana. Right? That's what the Torah tells us. And so it says B'shagam hu basar, ve'ayu yamav 120 shana. Moshe lived to be 120. And he was flesh, so that's a reference to Moshe in here. And B'shagam is Moshe. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and B'shagam is the gematria of Moshe. Exactly. And so Moshe hu basar v'ayu yamav 120 shana. That's kind of the teaching there. Okay. Haman min haTorah minayin. At least we've progressed to characters that don't appear explicitly hundreds or thousands of times in the Torah. But where's Haman alluded to in the Torah? Hamina etz. Why? Because Hamina etz, God is saying, did you eat from the tree of Etz Vadat? But Hamin is also Haman, and Haman is hung on a tree. So there's an allusion here to Haman ha'etz, okay? Esther min haTorah minayin. They continue with characters from the Megillah. Anochi aster astir, right? In the tochach, or in the context of the tocha, that if you don't, or slightly after tocha, but if you don't listen to the mitzvot, so God says, I will hide myself. So it says there, Esther. Mordechai min Torah minayin. Where do we see a reference to Mordechai? Dechthiv, it says in Shmot, in the context of the incense, the Ktoret. So it gives a list of, it talks about the spices. It says Mar Dror, which is one of the spices. And it says Metargaminan, and the translation in Aramaic of Mar Dror is Mara Dachya. If you take Mara Dachya, you combine them, you get Mordechai. Okay, so Mordechai is alluded to in the Torah in Mara Dachya. So this Gemara, I think, in and of itself, there's a lot to unpack about what it's really trying to get at. Right? It's finding allusions to these different people, but is there something deeper that's going on there? Right? With Esther, right? Anochi Esther Astir, because the whole idea of Migdal Esther is that it's Esther Panim and da-da-da. And Maharsha tries to give an explanation about why Mordechai, what the connection between him and the Shemen HaMishcha is. So he says as follows: "Valzeh amar Mordechai min haTorah minayin she'al yadav zachu linatzel mileasod bnei chorin." Right, that he helped Bnei Yisrael become free people from the threat of Haman. Milashon Mar Dror, because Mar Dror, he understands Dror here to be kind of ukratim Dror b'chol haaretz v'chol yoshvei, freedom. Ki hu v'siyato anshe knesset hagdola lo ratzu lishtachavot letzelem v'lo le'anot me'ota seuda. They didn't bow down to the idol or to Haman. They didn't benefit from Achashverosh's feast, which was, according to Midrash, celebrating the Churban. V'al shem shehu rosh ligdula. Ule something. Yep. Nimshal rosh besamim mishemen hamishcha. So he is kind of compared to the anointing oil, the most important of the spices. So Mordechai Maradachya. So that's Marsha's trying to understand what the connection between Mordechai and this Shemen HaMishcha, which symbolizes freedom, is. But if you note, right, Mordechai's own name is a play on words between Hebrew and Aramaic.
Right.
See? So to me, this kind of like ties really nicely with this whole kind of midrashic theme that was being developed in Menahot and the various midrashim about Mordechai Bilshan, that we saw Bilshan meant by Leish Nevidarish. Mordechai's own name is a perfect example of that. And so it kind of re-emphasizes why he is a good person to be the exemplar of that idea, and that's why Petachia merited to get the name Mordechai, because he was able to play with Gagot, Tzrifin, and Socher, so it's fitting that he's called Mordechai, which is Maradachia, which is a play on words between two different languages.
Very nice.
Shkoyach. Thank you very much.